The high country was already tasting of winter that year. Wind came skimming down off the crazy mountains, sharp as a knife's back, driving dust along the flats and rattling the dry grass around the fence posts. Zeke Northwood stood there at the corral, hat pulled low against the glare, watching his land settle under that restless sky. It wasn't much to look at to some folks. To him, it was everything he'd managed to hang on to. He was short on hands, shorter still on helping the house. One man bunking with the cattle crew, one woman trying to feed a spread full of hungry cowboys out of a kitchen that never got a rest. Zeke could hire another pair of shoulders for fence work without much trouble. Finding somebody who could keep pots boiling, biscuits rising, and peace in the cookhouse, that was a rarer thing. So he'd sent a letter east, asked for a woman who knew her way around a stove and didn't mind big skies and long silences. The reply had come neat and careful, signed by an Ellery Hayes. She'd be on the next coach, it said. No mention of anything else. The stage rolled in just after noon, wheels squealing as it dragged itself to a stop in a cloud of road dust. Zeke straightened from the post, brushing grit from his sleeves. The driver tossed down the mailbag, then swung the door wide. Passengers climbed out, stiff and blinking. Last of all came a woman with a plain brown dress and boots whitened at the seams from hard miles. She stepped down slow, one hand on the rail. The other arm cradled a small bundle wrapped in a worn blanket. For a moment, Zeke thought she was just helping someone else's child. Then the bundle shifted, and he saw a round, sleepy face, soft curls plastered to a damp forehead. That little fellow didn't belong to a stranger. He belonged to her. The woman lifted her chin, eyes meeting his steady as a rifle sight. They were a light, washed green like prairie grass under a pale sky, tired at the edges but proud all the same. "Mr. Northwood?" she asked. "That's right," he answered. "My name's Ellery Hayes. You wrote asking for a cook." Her fingers tightened around the child. "I can do the work, but I don't do it alone anymore. The boy stays with me." Zeke looked down at the child, maybe 2 years old, cheeks like ripe apples from the cold. A little mark sat just over his left eye, shaped like a thumbprint pressed in wine. Something thumped once, hard, in Zeke's chest. He knew that mark. He saw it every morning in the shaving glass. The boy's lashes fluttered, then lifted. Eyes the color of weathered steel blinked up at him, confused and curious. That same shade Zeke had carried his whole life stared back from a face half the size of his palm. The world seemed to tilt, just a fraction. Ellery shifted the boy higher against her shoulder, as if she could block the wind with her own body. "His name's Silas," she said quietly. Zeke had to clear his throat before his voice would come. "Ma'am, you'd best come inside. Wine cut's mean out here." He led them to the house, a low, plain building of timber and stone, its porch boards worn smooth by boots and time. Inside the room held the smell of coffee grounds and wood smoke, with a long table scarred by years of meals and elbows. It wasn't pretty, but it was solid. "Sit yourself down," he said. She lowered onto the chair with the stiff care of someone too used to standing, settling the boy across her lap. Silas rubbed his eyes and looked around, taking in the room without a sound. Zeke poured 2 cups from the pot on the stove. His hand shook once, so he tightened his grip and steadied it. He set one mug in front of her, then sank into the chair opposite. "There's something I ought to say right off," he began, eyes on the child rather than the woman. "That boy of yours, He stopped, swallowed. He carries my face. Ellery went still. Her fingers stopped moving against the blanket. For one long breath, the only sound was the wind combing past the eaves. I noticed, she answered at last. Zeke dragged a hand over his jaw, as though he could scrub the years away. We crossed paths before, Miss Hayes? She looked down at her son, brushed a curl from his forehead, then met Zeke's gaze again. Abilene, 5 years back. Big storm broke over the town that night. Her mouth twitched, halfway between a smile and a wince. You couldn't dance worth a lick. Memory rose up clear as lantern light. Rain hammering the roof of a crowded hall. Music loud enough to drown out thunder. A young woman in a blue dress laughing as he stepped on her toes, then laughing again when he finally found the beat. One night, no talk of tomorrows. When he rode out at sunrise, the bed had been empty and the town already shaken off the storm. He carried pieces of that night with him. Her laughter, the way her hair smelled like apples, but he left without a name that stuck. He sure hadn't ridden away thinking about babies. You never said, he murmured. I didn't know then, she replied, voice low but steady. I found out after you'd gone. I wrote to the ranch you mentioned. Letter came back with no answer, so I picked myself up and kept going. She squared her shoulders. I didn't come here to ask for anything from you, Mr. Northwood. I came because you needed a cook, and I need an honest wage. That's all. Celis had wriggled free of the blanket and was plucking at a loose thread on his mother's sleeve, lips pushed out in serious concentration. Zeke watched those small fingers for a moment, then pushed his chair back and walked to the window. The basin lay outside, wide and empty, ringed by distant mountains like a bowl in a giant's hand. He'd spent years believing the only thing he owed this land was his sweat and his stubbornness. Now there was a boy at his table bearing his eyes and his skin. Why this place? He asked quietly, still looking out. Because I had nowhere else left, she answered. Thought if you remembered me, maybe we could at least speak plain. And if you didn't, I prayed you'd treat us square macha. He turned then. The lantern light caught the faint hollows at her temples, the way she kept her back straight despite the long road behind her. She didn't look like a woman begging. She looked like someone who learned to stand up after every fall. You should have told me sooner, he said. I didn't have the right direction to send the truth, she replied, and I won't beg you for it now. I can cook. I can keep a house. That's what I came offering. Zeke crossed the room, slowly, like a man walking into water he knew would be cold. He crouched in front of the boy. Celis blinked up at him, solemn as a little owl, then reached out and laid his hand against Zeke's beard, testing the scratch of it. Ellery's breath caught, soft and sharp. Zeke felt that small palm against his jaw, and something inside him steadied. You'll stay here, he said, eyes never leaving the child. Both of you. You don't owe us. I didn't say I owed you, he cut in, gentle but firm. I said I want you here. Silence settled again, but it was a different kind this time. Not empty, just waiting. At last she gave one small nod. All right. By evening, the ranch hands were crowded around the table, spoons clinking against tin plates as they worked their way through stew thick with potatoes and beef. The new cook moved quiet between stove and table, refilling bowls, passing bread, cutting meat into small pieces for the boy beside her. Celis sat on a folded quilt to reach his plate, biscuit in one hand, spoon in the other, watching everything with wide, bright eyes. Zeke ate like he always did, quick and steady, but his focus kept drifting down the table to that child with the familiar brow. Every time the boy laughed, his whole face joined in. When he frowned at a stubborn bit of carrot, the crease between his eyes looked just like the one Zeke felt whenever a fence post leaned wrong. When the dishes were stacked and the lamps turned low, Zeke stepped out into the yard alone. Night had spread itself over the basin, deep and quiet. Stars pricked through the dark like nails holding up the sky. The house behind him glowed soft at the windows. He jammed his hands into his pockets and drew a long breath that tasted of dust, pine, and the faint sweetness of whatever she'd baked for dessert. He hadn't ever pictured himself as somebody's father. Hadn't dared imagine finding that woman from the storm again. Yet here they were, flesh and bone, green eyes and steel blue ones. 2 lives he hadn't known he lost until they'd climbed down from a dusty coach and walked straight into his yard. Zeke tipped his head back and studied the stars a moment longer. The land around him hadn't changed. Same hills, same cold wind, but under his boots the ground felt different, like something new had taken root there. Something he wasn't about to let blow away. He turned back toward the house, where the light waited and small shadows shifted against the curtain, and he knew, bone deep, that whatever came next, he meant to stand his ground with them. The next dawn came slow and silver, sliding across the plains like a quiet promise. Frost clung to every rail of the corral, turning the whole spread pale as moonlight. Zeke stepped out onto the porch with his coat buttoned high, breath rising in white puffs. He was used to cold mornings, used to carrying the day's burdens alone. But that morning felt different before he even understood why. A soft sound drifted from inside the house, Ellery humming low while tending the stove. Not a tune he recognized, just a gentle rise and fall, steady as a rocking chair. Then came the quick, light patter of small feet and the squeal of a chair leg scraping across the floor. Zeke smiled before he meant to. He found them in the kitchen, warm lamplight, pushing back the shadows. Ellery was rolling biscuit dough with a worn wooden pin, sleeves pushed up to her elbows. Flour dusted the front of her dress and left pale streaks on her wrist where she brushed away a loose curl. Zella sat beside her on the table's edge, safely wedged between a bowl and a folded towel, his little legs kicking while he gnawed the corner of a biscuit that hadn't made it to the oven. "You're up early," Zeke said. Ellery glanced over her shoulder, not startled, just aware. "Old habits," she answered. "When you travel as much as I have, rest never comes easy." Silas held out the mangled biscuit. "Share," he offered. Zeke took it, bit into the lopsided edge, and nodded solemn as a judge. Best I ever had." The boy giggled. Small, breathy, and bright. And something in Zeke lit up the same way a fire catches when you strike the last match in the box. Breakfast carried the quiet comfort of a house that hadn't known such ease in a long while. The ranch hands filtered in one by one, shaking frost from their hats, drawn by the smell of coffee strong enough to lift the dead. Ellery filled their plates without fuss, moving with a calm Zeke hadn't seen in most hired cooks. She listened, paid attention, set down food before a man even realized he'd been wanting it. Zeke watched her work with the steadiness of someone used to being overlooked, yet refusing to shrink. She didn't smile much, but when she did, her whole face softened, and the boy lit up like a lantern to match her. After the meal, Zeke slipped on his gloves and stepped outside. But he hadn't crossed half the yard before hearing small footsteps hurrying after him. "Da," Silas called, the word uncertain, shaped more by instinct than understanding. Zeke froze. Ellery stood on the porch, hands still damp from dishwater, eyes watching both of them with a mix of worry and apology. He doesn't mean, he just copies what he hears. The boy toddled up and wrapped his small arms around Zeke's leg with complete trust. Zeke looked down. Those steel blue eyes blinked up at him like morning stars. A man could walk away from many things, but not this. He scooped the child up, settling him easy against his chest. "You want to see the horses, little fella?" Tellis nodded so hard his curls bounced. Ellery exhaled, relief winding through her like a breath she'd held too long. She came down the steps, boots crunching over frost. "Only if he's not in your way." "He's not," Zeke said, "not one bit." They crossed the yard together, man, woman, and child moving through the brittle morning toward the stables. The horses shifted inside, hooves ticking against wood as the scent of hay and leather wrapped around them. Zeke carried Silas to the stall of an old gelding named Jasper, a gentle creature who behaved as if he'd been born half asleep. "This here's Jasper," Zeke said. "He's got more patience than every man on this ranch combined." Tillis reached out, tiny fingers brushing the horse's nose. Jasper snorted and dipped his head, accepting the greeting like it was a privilege. The boy laughed, pure and ringing. Zeke felt Ellery's gaze on them. When he turned, she wasn't smiling, exactly, but her eyes shimmered with something so raw and unguarded, he had to look away for a second. Life had dealt her more lonely miles than any woman should have carried alone. He saw it now, in the stillness of her shoulders, in the quiet way she took in the world, as if waiting for the next blow to fall. "Zeke," she said softly. He shifted the boy on his hip. "Yeah, there's something you ought to know." She hesitated, hands tightening around each other. "When I wrote back, telling you I'd take the job, I didn't truthfully expect to stay long." She glanced at her son. "Folks in most towns don't hire a woman with a child. They think she's slower or softer. They don't see what it costs to do everything alone." Zeke leaned his shoulder against the stall door, studying her the way a man studies a map before heading into new country. "You ain't slow, and soft don't mean weak." Her breath shivered out, half a laugh, half disbelief. "You don't even know me." "Maybe not," he answered, "but I figure I'm learning." Jasper snorted again, shaking his mane, breaking the tension just enough for Ellery to glance down and gather herself. "I'll work hard," she said. "I don't expect special favor. I won't be a burden." "You ain't one," Zeke said, voice low as the stables around them. "Not you, not him." Her shoulders lowered a fraction, just enough to show she'd heard him. By noon, clouds began crawling in from the west, heavy and dark. Snow threatened early that season. The ranch hands hurried to finish the outside chores before weather could trap them all indoors. While they worked, Zeke fixed a loose hinge on the chicken coop, all the while thinking about the woman and child now under his roof. Every memory of that stormy night in Abilene came back in pieces. Her laugh, her shy glance, the feel of her small hand gripping his sleeve when thunder cracked too close. He'd walked away from that dawn, believing the moment had been just a passing spark. Now he saw what that spark had lit. Toward evening, as pale flakes drifted down from a sky gone iron gray. Ellery stood on the porch, wrapping a small quilt around Silas. Zeke caught sight of them through the stable doors, mother and child framed in cold light, all alone in a world that had rarely been gentle. He wiped his hands and stepped outside. "Storm's coming through," he said. "Better settle in early." Ellery nodded, tucking the quilt under the boy's chin. "We will." But the wind pushed harder then, rattling the shutters, and for a heartbeat, her hand reached out, just an inch, like she meant to hold on to something before the world shifted again. Zeke caught that look, and he knew the road behind her had been long enough to carve hollows in her heart. He also knew the next move needed to come from him. "After supper," he said, voice steady, "I'd like to talk. Just you and me." She blinked, surprised. Then she swallowed once and gave the smallest nod. Silas looked up between them, oblivious, clutching the quilt edge as snow gathered in short gusts around their boots. Zeke met Ellery's eyes one more time. There was a question waiting there, quiet, fragile, and afraid to be spoken, and he knew before nightfall whether he was ready to answer it. Snow thickened as night drew its blanket across the basin. By the time the supper dishes were cleared and the ranch hands drifted back to their bunks, the storm had settled in full, soft, steady, and strangely peaceful. The wind no longer howled. It whispered along the eaves like an old friend come calling. Zeke stood by the kitchen doorway, thumb hooked in his belt, watching Ellery wipe down the long table. Kellis slept in a basket near the stove, one fist curled tight near his cheek, breath rising in tiny clouds. The lamplight warmed the room, giving everything a golden hush. "Ellery," Zeke said quietly. She paused, set the cloth aside. "You said we needed to talk." He nodded and motioned toward the porch. "It's cold, but the storm's eased a little. Might be easier to think without the racket of the house." She reached for her shawl. "All right." They stepped outside together, boots sinking into fresh snow. The flakes had grown smaller, drifting like feathers through still air. The lantern hanging near the door cast a soft circle of light around them, bright enough to see each other's faces, dim enough not to scare away honest words. Zeke leaned on the porch rail, arms folded. Ellery stood beside him, close enough he could hear her breath, but not so close she'd touch his sleeve by accident. She kept her eyes on the yard, where all sound had fallen quiet beneath the thick white cover. "You asked something earlier," he began, "about knowing you. Or not knowing you." She wrapped her shawl tighter, though the cold didn't seem to be what troubled her. "I didn't mean to push." "You didn't," he said gently. "Truth is, I remembered that night sooner than I let on." Her head turned a little. "You did? Hard to forget a woman who laughed in the middle of a thunderstorm," he said, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You weren't afraid of much back then." "I was afraid of lots of things," she murmured. "I just didn't want anyone to see." Zeke pushed off the rail and stepped in front of her, giving her room to back away if she wished. She didn't. Her chin lifted, the lamplight catching strands of her hair. "You've walked a long road," he said, "longer than I knew, and you carried that boy every step." Her eyes softened, rimmed with a sadness she tried to hide. "There were days I didn't know how we'd make it to the next town. I'd take work where I could, sewing, cleaning, cooking for folks who wouldn't even look me in the eye. Most places didn't want a baby around. Even fewer wanted his crying or his tiny boots underfoot. He felt something twist sharp inside him. You shouldn't have had to do that alone. She shook her head. Life don't give you choices that fine, Mr. Northwood. You take what's left on the table and pray you can make a meal of it. Zeke let out a long breath, wide in the cold air. I can't change what I didn't know, but I can answer for what I do know now. And what's that? She asked, voice barely above the hush of falling snow. That boy inside, Silas, he's mine. The words came low, certain, not a question, the truth. She swallowed hard. I knew what you'd see the moment you looked at him. I ain't blind, he said, and I ain't running from it. Her breath came unsteady. I didn't bring him here for you to claim him. I brought him because the world's too big when you're standing in it, without a place to belong. And do you think I'd turn you out? He asked. No, she whispered. I hoped you wouldn't. Snow drifted silently between them. For a long stretch, neither spoke. At last, Ellery's voice trembled slightly. There's something else you should know. I didn't come here expecting you to be anything. Not a husband, not a father. I only meant to work long enough to save for the next town. That's still what you want? He asked. Her eyes lifted to his, green and full of weary honesty. I don't know what I want anymore. He stepped closer, not so near as to scare her, but enough that warmth passed between them. Ellery, I ain't a man much for fancy talk, but I know this. I've spent a lot of years eating supper with an empty chair across from me. Too many mornings walking into silence. And tonight, for the first time, that house didn't feel so hollow. A faint, fragile laugh escaped her. Silas makes a lot of noise. Hard to feel hollow with him around. Not just him, Zeke said. The wind brushed past, lifting the edge of her shawl. She caught it, clutched it tight. I'm afraid, Zeke, she whispered. Wow, what of? Hope, she said. It hurts more than hardship when it breaks. He understood that better than he'd ever say out loud. A life on the plains taught a man not to want too much, but sometimes want crept in anyway. You ain't alone in that, he said. A soft whimper drifted from inside the house. Thella's stirring in his sleep. Ellery turned halfway toward the door, mother's instinct rising before she could help it. Zeke touched her arm gently. I'll see him, he offered. She blinked. You don't mind? I mind nothing about that boy, he said, voice warm as a fireside. Go on. I'll check on him. She hesitated, searching his face as though trying to understand the man standing before her. Then she nodded and slipped inside. Zeke followed a moment later, boots quiet on the wooden floor. He crouched by the basket. Silas shifted, rubbed his cheek, and reached blindly. Zeke offered his hand. Small fingers curled around his thumb. The rancher's breath caught, deep and low. No man could feel that and stay unchanged. He looked up when Ellery approached, shadows soft around her. He settled? She asked. He's fine, Zeke whispered. Their eyes met. No storm between them now, only a stillness, full of choices neither had spoken yet. Ellery brushed a hand over her son's hair. He sleeps easier here, she said quietly. Safer. Zeke rose to stand beside her. Then maybe you ought to stay more than just a few weeks. Her lips parted. No answer yet. Just the echo of a question she hadn't dared shape until now. Zeke didn't push it. Not tonight. Some truths needed to ripen like fruit on the branch But as he walked her to the bedroom door, he knew one thing for certain. That house wasn't just a ranch anymore. It was shifting, settling, becoming something more. And the woman standing in the lamplight, she was the reason why. Morning returned slow, as if reluctant to disturb the quiet that had settled over the ranch. Snow still lay heavy across the ground, smoothing every hard line into soft curves. Smoke curled from the chimney in a lazy ribbon, and inside the house, the air carried the warm scent of cinnamon and coffee. Zeke stepped into the kitchen, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Ellery stood at the stove, ladle in hand, stirring a pot that simmered with gentle pops. Her hair was braided back, loose strands brushing her cheek. Sella sat on the floor with a wooden spoon, tapping it on a tin cup in some private rhythm known only to children. "Morning," Zeke said. "Morning," she answered, offering a small smile, one that took root deep in him, quiet and steady. He poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, studying her in the soft light. She kept her focus on the pot, but now and then her gaze flicked toward him, shy as a colt still learning trust. "You sleep all right?" he asked. "I did," she said. "Thank you for checking on him last night." Zeke shrugged. Didn't mind. But the truth was, holding that boy's hand had shaken every part of him awake. Breakfast passed easy. Ranch hands filed in, filled their plates, and whispered to each other about the storm. Silas climbed into Zeke's lap midway through the meal, dropping crumbs everywhere. Ellery apologized for the mess, but Zeke just brushed the crumbs aside and let the boy settle in close. After the men left for the barn, Ellery turned to Zeke, her expression thoughtful. "There was something you said last night about staying longer than a few weeks." "Yes," he said. She folded her hands. "I've been thinking on it." He waited, letting her take her time. "This place." She scanned the room, the long table, the stove, the sturdy walls that had seen their share of storms. "It feels more like home than any place we've been in years." "It is home," he said softly. "For you," she murmured. "Not for us. Not yet." Zeke set down his cup, stepping closer. "It can be, if you let it." Just then, Silas toddled into the room, dragging one of Zeke's gloves like a trophy. He giggled when the glove's long fingers flopped around his feet. Ellery knelt to take it, but Zeke shook his head. "Let him play," he said. "I've got another pair." The door blew open with a sudden gust. One of the ranch hands, Buck, stomped inside, shaking snow from his hat. "Boss, mare's going into labor, and the cold ain't helping. We could use another pair of hands." Zeke nodded, grabbing his coat. He hesitated when he reached the door, glancing back at Ellery. Something in her eyes told him she'd been about to say more. "I'll be back soon," he said. "I know," she replied softly. "Go." Outside, the day cut sharp and cold. The mare, a skittish roan, paced inside her stall, breath fog in the air. Zeke worked alongside Buck, steady and sure, murmuring calm words to the trembling animal. Hours passed. The storm thickened again, but inside the house, Ellery stayed busy, humming while she scrubbed the table, then sewing a patch on Silas's small coat. The wind rushed against the windows, but she didn't flinch. This ranch, rough as it was, didn't feel threatening. It felt safe. She caught herself glancing toward the barn more than once. Maybe she'd grown used to crossing towns like stepping stones on a river, never staying long enough to let her heart settle But now, with every hour spent under this roof, she felt something quiet and warm stretch through her chest. When Zeke finally returned, snow dusted his shoulders, his breath ragged from cold and effort. Ellery opened the door before he reached for the latch. "She all right?" she asked. "No, mare's fine," he said. "So's the foal." "You're frozen," she murmured. "Sit by the stove." Zeke didn't argue. He eased into the chair near the fire, stretching his hands toward the warmth. Larry draped a quilt across his shoulders without asking. Her fingers brushed his neck for the briefest moment. It was enough to set his pulse beating slow and heavy. "Thank you," he said. She said nothing, just watched him with a softness he hadn't seen before. Celis toddled over and climbed into Zeke's lap again, curling up as if it were his favorite place in the world. The boy fell asleep within minutes. Zeke rested a hand lightly on the child's back, his breath settling into the same rhythm. Ellery hesitated, then lowered herself into the chair beside him. They sat together, no words, only the shared sound of the fire and a sleeping child. After a long while, Zeke spoke, voice low. "Ellery, you said this place ain't home for you yet, but I'd like it to be." She looked at her hands. "Zeke, I ain't looking to trap you. You didn't ask for this." "I didn't," he agreed. "But life don't always give you what you expect. Sometimes it gives you what you needed without knowing it." Her throat worked as she swallowed. "I don't want your pity. Pity ain't what I'm offering." He shifted Celis slightly, careful not to wake him. "A boy needs steadiness, and a woman like you ought not have to wander anymore. If you choose to stay longer, through winter, maybe through spring, I'd be grateful." He paused, then added, "And if you choose something more than staying, I won't shy from that either." Ellery's breath trembled. She reached out slowly, hesitantly, then touched the blanket wrapped around Celis. "I ain't said yes," she whispered. "I know. But I ain't said no." Zeke met her gaze, deep and steady. "That's enough for tonight." Snow pressed softly against the window, and the fire crackled. Warm, steady, alive. For the first time in years, Ellery didn't feel like a traveler pausing before another long road. She felt like a woman standing at the edge of a choice that could change her life. And somewhere, deep inside, she began to wonder if she was brave enough to take it. The storm broke for good. 2 days later, leaving the ranch draped beneath a clean, white stillness, snow softened every hard line of earth and timber, turning the world into something gentler than it had been in a long time. Smoke drifted from the chimney, steady as a heartbeat, and the air carried that sharp morning scent only winter knows. Zeke stepped outside before first light, the crunch of snow under his boots echoing through the hush. He needed a moment alone, time to sort the thoughts that had been stirring inside him. Like cattle restless before branding, the cold bit his skin, woke him deep, but his mind warmed with the memory of Ellery's quiet words. "I ain't said yes, but I ain't said no." It was more hope than he let himself hold in years. He fed the stock, checked the fences that stood half buried in drifts, then returned to the house. The door creaked softly as he pushed it open. Inside, lamplight glowed warm, and Ellery stood near the stove, brushing flour from her sleeve. Keela sat nearby on a folded quilt, stacking wooden blocks that Zeke had carved for him years before, blocks that had never seen use until now. Ellery turned, startled at first, then eased when she saw him. You were out early. Sun wasn't up yet, he said. I thought I'd get ahead of chores. You always trying to outrun your thoughts? She asked gently. Sometimes, he admitted. She nodded, as though she understood more than he'd spoken. Breakfast came together slow and comfortable. Fresh biscuits, eggs, and coffee warmed the room. Tillis babbled to himself while trying to feed Zeke a crumb he'd half chewed already. Zeke accepted it without complaint, and Ellery's soft laugh filled the kitchen before she could stop it. You're good with him, she said, voice barely above a whisper. He makes it easy, he replied. When the meal was finished and the dishes washed, Zeke stepped out back to chop firewood. The axe bit deep into each round, sending clean cracks echoing across the frozen yard. Ellery watched from the porch, arms folded around herself, not from cold, but from something wrestling inside her. She stepped off the porch and walked toward him, snow creaking under her boots. He paused mid-swing, lowering the axe. Something on your mind? He asked. I've been thinking on what you said, she replied. About staying. About more than staying. Zeke wiped his palms on his trousers, heart thudding slow and heavy. And what conclusion did you come to? Ellery looked down for a moment, gathering herself like a woman preparing to cross a river she'd feared for years. When she met his gaze again, her eyes were clear. I've spent so much of my life running toward the next scrap of safety, she said, but here, I don't feel like I'm running anymore. He stayed quiet, letting her speak. You gave us space without pressing. You made room for my boy like he was already yours. In this house, her voice caught. It don't feel like borrowed shelter. The morning wind tugged hair loose from her braid, carrying her words between them. I want Celis to grow where someone sees him, she said. Someone steady. Someone who won't vanish with the next sunrise. Zeke stepped closer, snow brushing his boots. Ellery's, I'm standing right here. She breathed in, the cold flashing white from her lips. If we stay, it's not just for the season. I don't want to uproot him again. You won't, he said, not if I've got any say. Her eyes softened, and she took one small step toward him, close enough their breaths mixed in the cold. Then I reckon I'm saying yes, she whispered, not to everything, but to starting, to staying, to letting this be home. Zeke's chest tightened, not with fear, but with the simple, quiet relief of a man who'd carried loneliness too long. He reached out, slow as sunrise, and touched her hand. She didn't pull away. Instead, she laced her fingers with his, tentative, fragile, and sure, all at once. Inside the house, Tillis began to fuss. Ella returned, mother's instinct rising, but Zeke squeezed her hand gently. Let me, he said. She nodded. Zeke walked into the warm glow of the house. Tila stood unsteadily beside the table, arms stretched toward him. Zeke lifted the boy into his arms, holding him with the ease of a man who'd done it 1,000 times, though this life had only just begun. Hey there, little fella, he murmured. You ready to stay put a while? Tillis rested his head against Zeke's shoulder with a sigh that felt older than his years. Ellery watched them from the doorway, her eyes shining softly. The scene looked like it had existed forever, like the house had simply been waiting for the right people to fill it. Later that evening, Zeke stood beside the fire while Ellery tucked Silas into bed. Snow drifted outside, but the house hummed with warmth. When she returned to the main room, Zeke cleared his throat. I know you said yes to staying, he began, but someday, when the time's right, I'd like to speak on something more. Ellery's breath stilled. Zeke. He raised a hand. Not tonight. Maybe not this winter, but I'm letting you know plain. I'm building towards something, and I hope you'll walk alongside me while I do. She stepped forward, her voice as soft as the falling snow. I ain't ready to answer that yet. You don't need to, he said. But I ain't afraid of the thought anymore, she added. Zeke's heart warmed more than the fire could manage. The night deepened around them. The storm quieted. The ranch held its breath in peace, and as Ellery stood beside him, her hand brushing his, her son sleeping safe in the next room, Zeke knew the land beneath his boots had never felt more like belonging, not because it was his, but because they were.